my students check the time. Welcome to this third session in the Reassessing Politics strand. Can social democracy survive in the 21st century? We've covered civil disobedience and activism, and in the last session I think we also looked and interrogated conservatism. So I think it's time we turn our fire to social democracy as the other ism that we're looking at today. My name is Peter Smith, and I've been trying to think what my credentials are for chairing this session. Sorry? I've always considered to be myself a man of the left, however I've never voted for the Labour Party, so apologies to Rowenna in advance.
Talk about that afterwards.
Talk about that afterwards, thank you. I'm told that my choice in food, wine, dress sense and my pedagogical techniques at university are conservative, but I'm certainly no Tory. And I'm a true liberal in the sense of a J.S. Mill sense of a tolerant, outward-looking liberal, but I find the current Liberal Party or Liberal Democrats very illiberal. And my hometown constituency MP for many years was Jeremy Thorpe, so make of that what you will. And younger members might want to Wikipedia that to brush themselves up on Jeremy Thorpe, who did the Liberal Party a great disservice to North Devon for many years. Okay, but we're very lucky that we have a much more knowledgeable and illustrious panel to interrogate these themes. We're going to come from it from a number of different angles, and we're very grateful that we have a European perspective from Johannes Busse, from the London Social Democratic Party of Germany London Group. Johannes is the co-founder of the Labour Friends of Germany and works for the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. I was going to say he's no doubt been very busy recently, but I'm informed that his work has very little connection to the reorganisation of the EU in its current form. Okay. Our second speaker is Rowenna Davis, who has spoken at a number of Institute of Ideas events before. She's a writer and commentator on political and social affairs, probably most notably for you if you've read her in The Guardian and The Observer and The New Statesman. In May 2011, Rowenna was elected as the Labour councillor for Southwark, or one of the Labour councillors for Suffolk, and is the author just out of Blue Labour and the Struggle for Labour's Soul. Okay, so just very, very topical. So today we'll find out whether she's blue or red. Unfortunately, Professor Paul Kelly has had some family issues and has had to pull out, and he's asked me to send his apologies to you all. He would have liked to have been here. His book is on sale upstairs, however, he managed to get that in. And then finally, our third speaker is Dr. Michael Fitzpatrick, who will be very familiar to Institute of Ideas attendees over a number of years. He's a GP, writer on political and medical subjects, and has asked me to say he's a veteran of the revolutionary left, dating back to the 1970s, and has written on a range of issues, social democratic politics, particularly the British Labour Party, over the last 30 years. We've only got an hour. I'm very conscious that we want to try and get as many contributions from the floor, so I'm going to be quite short and sharp with our speakers and go straight out after a couple of questions from myself to try and get the maximum audience participation. I think we've got an hour to do this, so contributions from the floor equally as succinct, and we'll try and get as many of you in as possible. If we'd like to thank our panel to begin with. Okay, Johannes, would you like to start?
Okay. We are talking about the future of social democracy in the 21st century. Even though many people are pessimistic, I'm very optimistic regarding social democracy in the 21st century. I think the values of social democracy are timeless, such as solidarity, liberty, social fairness, especially in education, where equal opportunities are pivotal for economic success and social cohesion. So, obviously, economic success enabled by right economic policies is also important. If you look into history, social democracy was most successful if the core values of social democracy were combined with an economic competency. We have to keep that in mind. So looking at a concrete example where social democratic policies basically work perfectly. As a half-Finnish, I always like to point to my mother country, Finland, where you actually have one of the most successful economies in Europe, with one of the highest GDP per capita in Europe and one of the fairest income distributions in Europe. How was it possible? Basically, it's an open, liberal economy, coupled with high personal income tax rates, financing one of the best education systems in the world, which is free of charge for everybody. Actually, students get subsidies for studying. So, quite a different model than, for example, here or in the United States. This is one point social democratic parties need to keep in mind, and this is where I see the future in terms of policies going forward. Secondly, I think parties need to change their organizational structure in a way that adapts to a 21st century properly. So they need to communicate with the outside world and to communicate with their members in modern ways. Making use of internet, for example. Using the internet for idea exchange and various forums will enhance the participation, especially from the youth and the interested, which basically left the parties during the last couple of years, when you see the age average of social democratic parties moving up. But secondly, you also need to have more direct participation for choosing candidates and other important policy decisions. If you look to France, where the Parti Socialiste just had primaries for the presidential candidate, it was a huge success. 4 million people participated and basically said they support the values of the left. It was not only a great means to get outside opinions and outside people to participate, but also a great start to start the campaign, and I think this is a good way to start a campaign in many other countries for social democratic parties. Thank you.
Right. We'll clap at the end if that's okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. 1 year ago, I sat at the Battle of Ideas Festival, and I gave this kind of very brave, strong defence of benefits in 5 points, classic sort of old left liberal defence. And I was just thinking about that when I came on my way here, because my politics have changed quite a lot in that time. And some people might call that politics that's alive, and some people might call it inconsistent. I'll let you be the judge of that. But it's changed. My politics has changed over the last year, and quite an emotional journey for me for two reasons. The first is that I wrote this book about Blue Labour, which, can I just say, is called Tangled Up in Blue and not available in the bookshop upstairs. But you can buy it from tangledupinblue.co.uk, don't worry. And then the second reason that it's changed is because I was elected as a councillor to serve in Southwark, not Suffolk, I should say. The Labour Party does need to do more in rural areas, but my heart is in Southwark. And the answer to the question, can social democracy survive, is the same as it was a year ago for me. And that is, yes, but it bloody needs to be done differently than what Labour just did in the last government. Okay? So the answer is the same, but how it does things differently is changed for me. And I think there are really two really big concerns facing social democracy now that we haven't addressed and that we need to. And particularly I'm talking about from the Labour Party perspective here. The first is political economy. Our entire model of doing the economy from 97 has just died, and we need to really think about that. The second is the lack of transformational welfare that happened despite a high level of state spending. And I think that's something we also need to address. So I'd just like to say a few words about both of those things. I think on political economy, first of all, I think Hope Sen said this absolutely fantastically. He wrote this article a while ago where he raised a single question that's still kind of hanging in the minds of in the air throughout all Labour politicians, which is that what happens when you don't have growth? What is the Labour Party for when you don't have growth based on financial industry? And let's just be very, very clear here about Labour's model of political economy while we're in power, and I say that as a member of the Labour Party and elected representative, is that for 10 years we effectively allowed the city to grow, and our entire country's economy was based on the growth of the city, which was based on nothing more than a bubble. And what we did is we allowed that to grow, and with the proceeds of growth, We were able to invest massively in public services and do great, great things. You know, we were able to transfer benefits to some of the poorest areas. We were able to gentrify areas of the north. But we never created a new political economy. We simply allowed the city to grow and creamed off the top and carried on. What happened in 2008 was that bubble burst. And that growth was built on nothing. And now we're left saying, what on earth are we going to do? And to me, the key question that the Labour Party has to answer and social democracy has to answer is, where is that growth going to come from in the future? Because we still want to fund state services. We still want public investment. We do still want a role for the state. But how are we going to pay for it? And I think that's a really, really key issue. And there's some very interesting work here. I think the question about how we're going to make money is inextricably linked to the question of what can we make? What do we make as a country? And there's some really interesting work going on here at the moment. Tune is doing some really good work about whether there can be an industrial policy that's more than picking winners. And that's something I'm very interested in. I went to a talk he went to the other day, and he was talking about how the fact that the country has never done a survey of what our entire skills base are. We have no idea what Britain is really, really good at doing at the moment, or what our graduates are very, very good at doing. And we don't really have an idea of what the big gaps are in the global market economy. And so we're not branding ourselves as that as such. We're not like the Asian countries that go out and say we're brilliant at electronics, we're brilliant at engineering. We're literally just allowing the market to do whatever, and we're not actually at the moment known for very much. And I wrote an article in the Observer today about, you know, we do have a history of kind of art and creative industries. But we need to start thinking, I think, about that. And that doesn't mean going back to an industrialist kind of old-style policy, but it does mean looking at what the gaps are, what our skills are, how we could brand ourselves better, and what we can do in terms of education policy to make those things join up a little bit better. The other thing that the Labour Party needs to do in terms of the economy and plugging that gap is looking at private business. We have no conversation for entrepreneurs or small business people at the moment. And I think we need to change that. So that's point one, sort out the political economy. Point two is I think that we need to deal with the issue of welfare and how we do the state. Now, Blue Labour has often been criticised because we're told that it's conservative and fundamentally anti-state. It's not. It's about doing the state very, very differently. And I say that as, if we can talk Chatham House rules at the moment, as someone who's come into local government quite recently, I have been quite terrified by the amount of waste and bureaucracy that goes on there. I am quite worried by how many emails I have to send that never get replied to, and how many times my constituents have to call up and have their calls unanswered or dealt with in a bureaucratic and inefficient fashion. We need to change the way that we do those things. I find the best work that I do as a councillor is my work community organising amongst them, especially when I speak as someone who is a councillor for someone where the riots just happened. And just as an example of this, you know, in the past, when earlier on when I first came into office, if someone had come to me with a problem of antisocial behaviour, you know, I would have gone round to see them, emailed the Safer Neighbourhood team. Maybe in 1 or 2 weeks an officer would have come round to see them, and then it might have got better for a week, and then it would have gone back to the same way it was before. I now will look at that person and say, yes, I'll make the call to the Safer Neighbourhood team, but who are your neighbours? And how can we build relationships in communities between people, as well as with the state? And how can we use our roles as elected representatives to build those communities at a time when people just do not talk to each other? And that doesn't necessarily mean going with the big society and reducing the state. It just means doing the state differently. So an example when I was talking to Maurice Glassman is quite tangible as well, is instead of giving a single mum a council house, you give her a stake in a community land trust. So you'd almost compel her, in a way, to work within a community of other people and take responsibility for the resources and the assets that she has in that way. So those are my two big points.
To draw out the problem that the Labour Party had become a vehicle for containing the movement, the radical movement, and the possibility of the transcendence of capitalism. How could the left deal with this? Ralph Miliband resigned from the Labour Party in the mid-60s and was part of a whole series of intellectual and organisational movements over the next 20 years to try and construct some sort of alternative to the Labour Party. And one of the ironies of his book, Parliamentary Socialism, is it was republished in different forms every few years with a different introduction or a different foreword or a different afterword, all of which hedged around this problem of how the left could deal with the Labour Party. 1976 famously wrote, "The most crippling of all illusions," he said, was the idea that the Labour Party could be transformed into a socialist party. And the most crippling of all illusions, unfortunately an illusion to which Ralph Miliband himself ended up being a victim. Because what happened in the whole succession of episodes through this period was that every time the Labour Party was perceived as a force, as a negative force, as a betraying the forward movement of Labour, this attempt to create an alternative would emerge, and then an election would come along and the whole thing would be forgotten, and as happened in the 78-79 period, and the whole of the left argued that okay, the Labour Party had all these characteristics, but it was the lesser evil to the Conservatives and everybody should succumb and vote for the Labour Party. That was what Who Needs the Labour Party was a challenge to, and it had a very, as I say, it provoked a very negative response because it posed very directly a political challenge to Labourism. Beyond the challenge that Miliband, in terms of its understanding of the whole functioning of the Labour, particularly organisationally saying, look, what's really important here is we need to build an alternative to the Labour Party rather than endlessly trying to exist within it. And whereas the entire rest of the left, and there were endless different factions and fragments and movements of the left, all supported the Labour Party in the election. What happened next is, everybody knows what happened next. Thatcher triumphed. The 80s was the decade of Thatcher. Her government went from strength to strength. Sorry, I've got to wind up on that. You know what happened left. I'll cut that short. Until the left in the Labour Party had a brief flowering in the 80s, and then it all collapsed with a collapse in the end of the 80s, early 90s, with the end of the Soviet Union, which marked the end of class politics. In a sense, the end of an era that opened in 1848, not just the throwing back of the Russian Revolution, but of the whole gains of the previous 100 years. And looking back in retrospect, I think we can see the era after 1968 was the last gasp of that era, when the dominant tension in world politics was between capital and labour, between the left and the right. Fukuyama famously argued this thesis that this marked the end of history. It didn't mark the end of history, obviously, but it did mark the end of politics in the old form. Particularly, it marked the end of the historic role of social democracy, because it was social democracy whose very existence was dictated by its relationship between the poles of capital and labour, between left and right, between the working class and the capitalist class in terms of the working out of politics. And when that polarisation no longer existed, the traditional social democracy no longer had a role, and the parties of labour became redundant. A parallel process, I know this was a subject of the early discussion, there was a parallel crisis afflicted the right. The Conservative Party also disintegrated following this period, and right-wing parties had a parallel crisis, so that's a separate story, although a related one. So the question is, can social democracy survive this sequence of events? And the answer to that is only by fundamentally reconstituting itself. And the model for that, of course, is New Labour. Which has existed as a model not just in Britain, but in Europe, the rest of Europe as well. In other words, by negating its history as a party of the working class, as a party of the labour movement, as a party which had the goal of socialism, all these things were abandoned in quite explicit terms. And in a sense, numerous other alternatives. Of course, that project had a transient success in the context of the whole Blair phenomenon. And that has now reached the end. It has a very short life expectancy in the current instability of the political world. And so you see all sorts of new alternatives now proliferate. Interestingly, colour-coded. So you've got Green Labour as one option that Labour's, and this has happened in Europe. The old part of the Labour gone into coalition governments with Green parties. We've seen Rainbow Labour quite successfully. The idea of Labour as a multicultural party under Ken Livingstone being quite successful for a period in London. Ken Livingstone, in a way, foreshadowed the kind of politics of celebrity as an alternative way of support. You know, he was the Arnold Schwarzenegger of British politics before Schwarzenegger was successful in California. And that too has become a busted flush. We have Blue Labour, Rowenna articulately defends here. Blue Labour, close to my heart because the Baron Glassman of Stoke Newington and Stamford Hill, that's where my surgery is. So he's a very much regarded as a local boy. But it has some striking familiarities to me too, as somebody who's brought up in Sheffield. Blue Labour, you know, a kind of Labour Party that related to the more conservative sections of the working class population in terms of a general communitarian, socially conservative, anti-immigrant, anti-welfare, you know, all sorts of fairly familiar themes. And it's, you know, there's a constant reworking of old things out of the old locker. Purple Labour, we've got, I think people have noticed Purple Labour, Peter Mandelson's retrospective to kind of construct a new Labour Party which is more responsive to the needs of the banking and financial sector. I can't see that getting forward. And of course, there's even a role for Red Labour. And you see this throughout Europe, rumps of old Stalinist, Trotskyist, old left social democratic movements have come together with varying degrees of electoral success. Because such is the incoherence of the political realm throughout Europe in the recent period, is anybody, you know, look at the pirate parties now on the rise in Scandinavia and elsewhere. You know, look at the Irish presidential election. I read an interesting commentary on this yesterday. You know, that the interesting feature of that is that basically anything could have happened in that election, and that's the current state of the political firmament. Virtually anything can happen in the world of politics as it kind of the incoherence and instability that's come into it, and scandals and all these sort of things from celebrity all take priority. Virtually anything can happen, I would say, apart from a return to classical social democracy. You know, that is not a possibility. The historic role that social democracy played, and in a sense that was its heyday was a very long time ago, between 1890 and the First World War. That was its historic heyday. It's had a prolonged posthumous existence since then, but it's really history.
Okay, thank you.
Fantastic.
Okay. Okay, Johannes, if I could come to you first. You painted you know, a very vivid picture of the offer, if you like, of social democracy. Given Europe at the moment, the perils and difficulties in Europe, does it not surprise you that the appeal or the protests tend to be bypassing traditional politics? It tends to be elsewhere that people are looking for new social movements, the indignados, and various other areas. That seems to be the appeal to youth, rather than your picture as one where social democracy can attempt to give people some future hope.
That's right, yeah. First of all, I agree with Michael. We have to overcome the old traditional ways. Social democracy, or we have to represent the center of traditional classes, but unfortunately, Michael, my memory doesn't go back as yours, as far as, but it's fine. Yeah, the question is, yes, the youth basically, parties became older and older, and the youth didn't, or wasn't fascinated anymore by parties in general. It's not only a phenomenon which is peculiar to social democratic parties. If you see it, other political parties where age average also moves up. And you mentioned the pirates, Michael. Actually, they emerged from Germany, not from Scandinavia, but it's fine. And this is a party which basically went into a niche, basically internet, transparency and privacy, which was not at all taken care of by the traditional political parties. So we see, if we neglect certain policy areas, other players will move in and will basically take this niche, and parties need to learn from it and apply these lessons learned, and we need to be more aggressive and open in terms of using new technologies, internet, and all the new ways of technologies, adapt the way of communication to the current century. The methodologies of how parties work originated in the last century. We need to reform it. So if we do that, I'm pretty optimistic that we can win back the youth. I mean, I actually joined the social democracy, and I think other young people can be motivated to join these movements if we offer attractive forums for communication and changing actually something, and that's where I see it.
Okay. Rowenna, I mean, I was surprised at the Labour vote in the last election. It held up so high. In speaking to colleagues and friends and people at work, what sort of dawned on me is that I think people were voting to protect their jobs. So I don't know whether this feeds into your idea of, you know, how we do welfare in the state. But is it not the case that the Labour vote in the UK is really quite self-serving now? It's basically people employed by the state, receiving state welfare, thinking, you know, I want to protect my position. I'm very individuated. I mean, I almost thought about voting Labour, you know, work at a university, vote Labour, and keep my job. So is that not just a sort of grandees from the state, if you like? State spending's created its core constituency now.
It's a very interesting question. I think one reason why Labour did so well was actually because the Conservatives weren't presenting something that was particularly interesting or informative, and I think that can't be underestimated. I mean, they did not properly win that last election, and I think that was for a number of reasons, and I'm sure that protecting the economy and protecting employment is going to be one of those reasons. I think people saw through what Cameron was saying, and they're increasingly seeing through what he's saying. On your point about who Labour's talking to right now, I think there is I'm really interested in the millions of people out there who aren't voting. I think the Labour Party at the moment is very, very interested in the small minority of people who are voting, who are in swing areas. And that's two very, very different constituencies. What Blue Labour says, if I might go back to that, is we need to be looking at those people who were traditionally voting Labour, who are out of work. And what's very interesting there is that a huge number of those people, that kind of white working class constituencies that maybe are out of work at the moment, are dependent on those benefits that Labour gave. They are dependent on weekly job seekers allowance, but they're still not voting Labour. And that is something that I find very, very interesting, because although they are dependent on state handouts, they are fundamentally unhappy and dissatisfied with the status quo. And they're the kind of constituency that Blue Labour wants to talk to and re-engage. And I just find it really interesting that and this has been a real challenge for me personally, so I don't want to make it into an interrogation, that a lot of the kind of liberal, middle-class people who will defend on the left benefits will be making arguments that people on benefits really, really disagree with. And I think that that's something that we really have to face up to. And I say that as someone who, I'm a councillor in Peckham, and one of the estates I'm most interested in are the kind of white working class areas where I was at their Halloween party last night. And talking to them there about their fundamental dissatisfaction with Labour, people who should have been voting for them, who just don't feel that we're doing enough. And I think the party needs to change and to respond to that. Okay,
thank you. Mike, I mean, you presented a very vivid picture. Social democracy can't re-emerge in its old form, and people sort of disengaged from that process over a protracted period of years, but people didn't vote for your politics either, didn't go for your politics either. Does it have to, is there no future for a sort of centre-left alternative, which does alleviate some of the issues that are happening with the current crisis going into the future? Is that not an appealing prospect for people?
No, I don't think it is. I mean, it's true. I mean, the collapse that came in the early 90s brought down not just the Soviet Union and old Stalinist bloc. It brought down the social democratic world too. It's interesting. There was a sort of anticipation that the collapse of communism might lead to the improvement in the fortunes of social democracy. It didn't have that effect at all. It had exactly the opposite effect. It also it meant that those standing outside, whether they were inside or outside the old Labour movement, the collapse of the Labour movement itself meant that the prospect of an anti-capitalist politics based on that sort of based on the working class that historic possibility closed. So the question, what can what can be done now? I think the answer to that is that there's no scope in the contemporary political world for the reformulation of a Labour Party in its traditional form. Because the idea of a class basis for that, of a working class, which is not just something which exists as a it's quite interesting that Marx made the point the working class is revolutionary or it is nothing. And what we have, and it's, I think in Rowenna's conception of the white working class, is a working class which is nothing. It's a section of society which is a recipient of benefits. It's the object of social policy. It's not the subject of social change. And I think that unless you've got a situation where you've got an active agent of social change, then you can't base a politics upon that. You've got a politics which is based on public sector professional intervention of the Guardian reading public professional world who are basically trying to do things with this so-called white working class constituency. It's never going to take the form of a political alternative.
I was going to be strict, but Rowenna wants to come back very quickly on that one.
And that critique of the kind of middle class managerialism of white working class communities is the thing that I think Blue Labour rallies against in the most sort of strongest terms. And it's something that I really, really disagree with as well. Where we're going to part ways is whether that's ever possible to change. And I think if you look at the work of, I think some really good examples of work has been coming out of Citizens UK, for example, about the campaigns for the living wage that have been run time and time again across banks, across Tesco's recently. You'll see that kind of change can be possible, and it's not quite the conventional union-based politics that it used to be. Because it's much more kind of multi-faith groups, it's institutions, it's colleges, it's students, it's faith leaders coming together to campaign, but it is still making a difference. And I think the thing that I think would be transformational is if Labour remembered a little bit more about where it came from. This is a party that was formed, in the late 1800s with workers organising against capital. And that's something that I think both of us are going to be agreeing with here. Where we're going to disagree again is on whether the point of the Labour Party is to capture the state and then manage people, or whether it's to work with people in a kind of transformational way that empowers them rather than manages them.
Okay, right, your turn. Hands up, please. The gentleman down the front here has had his hand up before we even finished. Keep your hands up, please.
Yeah, I don't see much opposition on the panel, so I'll try to challenge you a bit.
What's your name, sir?
Jean-François from France. Yes, I think social democracy has a bright future. I'm afraid it has a bright future because the message, of sharing and I think lends itself to winning elections. Obviously, the minority may not agree with it, but I'm sure the majority agrees with it. And we have a perfect example. Look at Argentina. The economy is almost bankrupt, yet Cristina has just won a landslide. So I think it's got pretty good success because of the message and because it rests also on a central bank and fiat money, money, paper money. In our case, in the West, the US, and Europe, it would be interesting to I think the crisis is a really important thing. I think it has nothing to do with a failure of capitalism and free markets, because it's all the bubble was created by this very central bank creating money. Yet social democrats and the mainstream has managed to put the blame on capitalism and free markets. Could you explain to us why you think this crisis is a failure of capitalism and free markets rather than socialism?
Okay, thank you. If I could take the gentleman behind you.
Thank you. One thing that was only mentioned from the last minute from the panel, other than in the context of unions attacking social democracy from the hard left, is the role of unions. And I think if you asked a social democrat of the 1970s whether a party of the left that did not emerge organically from the trade union movement would count as social democratic, they would have said no. So do you think that the working class can be, and particularly the private sector working class, can be organised in a way that would support a major political party? And if that can't be done, do you think a party of the left can still, that isn't based on the unions, can still be called social democratic?
Okay, thank you. I'll take a few more, and the gentleman down the front, and then we'll go to the back.
Thank you. My name is Ted. I'm from Sweden, and my country has a long, long history of social democratic rule. Now, I don't agree at all with your take on it that the social democrat needs to, get out on the internet or other communication, because the social democrats in Sweden, they have nothing to say. That's the problem to start with. They rule the country, and they did good for the country for many years. But once the social democratic thought was in place, laws, social security, they had nothing more, and they sort of just kept it up, and they turned from healthy socialism to what I yesterday called klepto-socialism, where Greece is the best example of it.
Okay.
They have to have new ideas, which they don't.
Thank you. Let's take a couple at the back. So Alan Miller, right at the back, please.
I think even worse than not being able to politically inspire the working class, which obviously the Labour Party, whatever colour it is not trying to do, is the terribly outrageous and nasty, pernicious way it thinks about ordinary people. And this is not directed at you, Rowenna, personally, but I mean, just everything from the whole campaign around espouse, the discussion around social inclusion. Either white working class people are racist and violent and out of control, or they're mad and in need of therapeutic intervention. So, I mean, I think that's obviously a problem. I think the distinction between social democracy and just a party, I think just that it's just obviously something that calls itself the Labour Party can carry on going. And it does surprise me that it still manages to recruit obviously articulate, smart people who want to make things happen, right? That's a surprise to me. I think the question for people who would like to see more fundamental change and transformation is how you actually move forward. Do you do it on the basis of trying to get involved with something like a party like that? Or do you attempt to actually criticise and explain and pose an alternative, even when that's not exactly clear what that will mean?
Okay, thank you. And if we could come down to Neil Davenport, who's arranged this strand.
Okay, thank you. I was chairing the Conservatism session previously where it happened to Conservatism, or rather what came Conservatism to like the 21st century, and I think Mike is right in the parallel process that's taken place with both Conservatism and social democracy. Because I think in 1945 the social democracy guys was about preventing ordinary people from implementing meaningful change in society, social change. Social democracy in its 1995 guys was a hostility to ordinary people just making decisions on an ordinary day-to-day basis. This would be very much, as Alan pointed out at the back, that contempt for ordinary people's ability and capacity to make moral choices has been severely undermined by the new form of social democracy since 1995. And the upshot of that is that obviously that's had an influence on Cameron's Conservatives as well. So there's been a parallel with the new evolution of social democracy has had an influence on Cameron's Conservatives as well. And how this has come about, if you think about the collapse of left and right as a political force in British and European society, is that politics in the past was always about winning over hearts and minds, and it was rooted in beliefs and it was rooted in values. And if those beliefs and values have been smashed through historical reasons, how can you engage citizens? Citizens only become engaged through the state. And I've recently read Melissa Ben's book on the education system, School Wars, and she seems terrified of the idea that parents may want to set up their own school. And so whenever she uses the term neoliberalism, what she's really referring to is an individual who will not take part in a new Labour project with the state. It's somebody who aspires for autonomy is quickly labelled as a neoliberal, and I think that's what's happening. The emptying out of politics, the state becomes all, either through welfare or through coercion. Because New Labour, like Cameron's, have got no ideas and have got no beliefs to engage the hearts and minds of people, the state takes priority, and I think that's the new form that social democracy has taken. And I think it can survive in that form in the absence of real politics, because Cameron came to power with a big society, but even he feels nervous about trying to renew autonomy in society.
Okay, if the speakers would just like to come back, I mean, don't address everything by all means, there's lots coming up, we've only got about 20 minutes left. Selectively just come back on those points that you'd like to address.
Okay, the point was first made by Jean-François, right? Failure of capitalism. I mean, we could argue for hours about the causes for the financial crisis, but I think we can agree, or we agree, that there are several causes which basically resulted in this disastrous situation. First of all, yes, there was wrong monetary policy, especially in the United States. The market was flooded with cheap money, which basically created this real estate bubble. But secondly, there were greedy, to use this term, financial institutions which basically were not able to price risk adequately. They didn't differentiate between German government bonds, Finnish government bonds and Greek government bonds, which was not adequate. So I believe, and that's basically social democratic policy, if we reinstitute the right regulatory regime, I just named the Glass-Steagall Act, basically separating deposit-taking institutions from investment banks, Volcker rule, prohibiting proprietary trading in banks, and all this stuff. This is important to basically create a stable financial market. If we look into the last several decades, we didn't have a single big financial crisis which could be compared to the current one or to the one at the end of the 20s, where these regulatory regimes were actually in place. So I'm in favor of having a stable financial market which does not basically takes the profits and socializes the losses. So this is my stance on that. And the second question I would like to answer is the point raised from the gentleman from Sweden. Obviously, I agree. New ideas need to be there, and you can't just manage the status quo. Probably at the end, or actually a couple of years ago, when the Conservatives won in Sweden, the Social Democrats didn't have any new ideas, and they just managed the status quo. And obviously, after a couple of years, I think it's due that power changes. So I'm not in favor of one-party rule. So I think it's actually good that you change government at least every 10 years or so. I mean, because otherwise, it becomes a klepto, it becomes not efficient, and people create red tape and corruption. So these are my answers to these questions. Thanks.
Thank you. Right.
Okay. A theme that's been running through these questions, and I'm sorry I can't do them all justice, I'll be around afterwards to have a longer chat, is this kind of hatred of the working class that the political class seem to have. And I hear that. I really hear that. I mean, I don't know if you see it, but when you're watching a politician on TV, you can tell that they're kind of one step removed, and they're in their own head, kind of looking down at what they're saying, going, "Oh God, what shall I say?" And you know, how can I win these people round? And oh God, it's awful that I have to have these kind of views, but you know, these kind of ridiculous white working class people just need to hear them. You know, which was typified, I think, massively by Gordon Brown's treatment of Gillian Duffy, for example. You know, which really exposed like what kind of elite political class can tend to feel about people. And I'm of the belief that if you go into politics, you should love people. You should really, really love them and want to serve them. And you shouldn't want to manage them. People shouldn't be something that you have to get over in order to get your own way. They should be people that you listen to and that you respond to. The problem with that comes when, what happens when your particular beliefs do disagree with others. I mean, we heard over here that, white working class people were being portrayed as, or everyone who was subject to espouse, for example. Yeah. The problem comes when you realise when you go to those communities and you talk to them, and actually they have the strongest beliefs in favour of espouse, in favour of stronger jail sentences. What do you do then? That's the question. And I think the problem comes largely in the nature of the people who are representing us these days, because the policies, even when they are kind of more authoritarian or more socially conservative, are still coming from what is perceived to be a white, liberal, middle-class homogenous group. They are not coming from working class leaders in the same way that they used to be, and that's a real challenge for us. And there's a real question there about how you engage then those people, which lays on to your question earlier. Like what I'm, like on a very basic level, what I'm doing in my constituency at the moment is when people are coming to me in my surgery and talking about antisocial behaviour, I'm working on trying to set up 5 different residents' associations at the moment. I'm literally saying to people, go round, knock on 5 of your neighbours' doors, have a conversation with them, bring them round for a meeting. If there's antisocial behaviour going on, you can deal with it as a block, and I will be there to help support you. I am not saying that that's like going to cause a revolution by any means, but I am saying it's the first step of engagement that doesn't say, you can come to me in my surgery and as the kind of middle class lady, I'll try and help sort out your problems by making some phone calls by someone else higher up in government. I'll go and look to you and I say, what the hell are you doing? Okay. And I think we have to answer that. I would like to talk about unions, but I obviously don't have time. I think it's more important we hear from you. Can we talk about that afterwards?
Yeah, okay. Mike.
I think that the problem that Rowenna faces, and I see this having worked in East London for 30 years, which apart from a long experience of the incredible wastefulness and incompetence of public sector bureaucracy, which is another whole issue, which I'm very well familiar with in the health service, but also the whole tradition of the labour movement in that area is very instructive, I think, in terms of the current attitudes of most people to the Labour Party. And so you had in East London, in the post-war period, that, for example, the major employer there was the docks, historically. The docks were basically run by the Transport and General Workers Union in various varieties. The Transport and General Workers Union very efficiently made sure that no black person ever worked in the docks. In fact, nobody, not even any Jewish people in the first wave of threat to that. It was maintained that very efficient policy. One of the great ironies of more recent years is that you can find calls. I've had leaflets coming out from the Transport and General Workers Union organising demonstrations against the BNP in East London. You know, and that's an irony of history for you. So that was the unions played that role, and the Labour Party running the council had the role of running the housing policies, for example, in a way which is also racially discriminatory and also had a very poor standards. And so there was a sense of anybody who lived in that area who had a sense of wanting to improve their lives, they got out. You know, they all went to Essex, where they're now subject to a great caricature, of course, in the whole British political stand. But that, you know, if you wanted to get out, that's what you did. And interestingly, one of the policies that was most successful in terms of the Thatcherite drawing of electoral support away from the Labour Party was the sale of council houses. You know, because that was the way in which if you were a person condemned to council housing, you could at least improve your housing position. The only way you could improve your lot. So all that has created not only has it fostered racial animosities and divisions in the communities in areas of inner London, which fester to this day, but it has also created a sense of alienation of ordinary people from the Labour Party in an entirely understandable way. And so now we've reached a stage where somebody else, you know, we've got a kind of parallel disintegration of the political system, and there's a notion that everywhere is so powerful is the idea you can reach back to the past to try and reconstitute things. And there's a holding on to the politics of left and right. It's over. You know, we've got to start again. It's over. The idea that we can base a politics on that whole set of ideas and institution, everything else, it's over. And it's nothing is more hopeless than looking to the past to try and reconstitute a future political organisation.
Okay, thank you. We'll take. I know time is really, really precious. I'm sorry, but we'll try and take as many as we can. We've only got about 10 minutes, so if I could take the gentleman there with the blue sweater.
Yeah, the question is can social democracy survive the 21st century? And it's so good to have Johannes here because we're such an insular society. And when you listen to Johannes's description of Finland, who couldn't vote for that? And when people talk about not winning the hearts and minds, we tinker around about what's going on this estate, that estate. But I suspect most people in this room have read The Spirit Level. And unless you're incredibly selfish, even if you're very wealthy, who couldn't vote for that? But you're not telling that. The Labour Party is not telling that story. They're not, in business terms, they don't have a clear vision that they're selling.
Okay, thank you. The lady down the front.
So I just wanted to ask a question. The question was, how has that developed in Finland? You know, where did it come from? If you've got time, really quickly, how did this sort of come about? And what are the chances of it happening here?
Okay, if you could pass the microphone to the guy next to you, the lady down the front here, please. Thank you.
I just wanted to put in a word in defence of Melissa Ben, because I do think one of the things that has made great difficulty for the left in this country is the division in the education system. That a start was made on a socially responsible education system within which you can be as autonomous as you like within a socially responsible structure, but we've given up on that completely. And then, okay, why we're not happy with the idea of parents setting up their own schools is that it creates more and more division. You know exactly which parents are going to get together and set up their own schools. And the way I hear people talking about the working class as if they were some other race I find very distasteful, because I've worked with the working class most of my teaching life, and we have lost our courage of actually setting up structures that bring people together, and schools are probably the most important.
Okay, thank you very much. Gentleman over, thank you.
Well, I'm far too young to remember Michael Fitzpatrick article from 1978, but I do remember one he wrote a few years later after going up to a Labour Party conference. And this article made the point how motion after motion had called upon the state to provide things for people. And that, it seems to me, is the essence of Labourism. And the only reason why Labour had some success between 1997 and 2010 was because it was able to massively expand the public sector. Public spending has gone through the roof over that period of time, and it's because the Labour Party sees itself in terms of giving things to people through the state, whether it's the central state or the local state. Now, I see you're nodding in agreement, Rowenna, but so the question is, have you been able to break free from that? Well, I don't think you have. What you were talking about is, you said, how can we build communities? The we there being a reference to you as a councillor. You're talking all the time about what you can give people. And then what was your big idea? Well, you said, in addition to the people you see in your surgery, the question isn't just, how can we give her a council house, but how can we give her a stake in a community land trust? Now, come on, you cannot break free from this tradition of yours, which is all about handing out things to people as part of the state. And the other side of that argument, the reason why you can't do it is because you cannot see the resourcefulness and rationality of people as individuals. You're wedded to the state. You're wedded to the state, and the sooner the Labour Party doesn't just die, but is buried, the better.
It is the battle of ideas, so let's get going. Lady in the front.
If I was 18 today, I would tell this panel, thank you very much, but you made this huge debt, which I'm going to have to work for the rest of my life. I've got to pay for pension of you older people, yet I'm going to pay for my university fees, pay for your wars. Thank you very much, but I'd like to opt out. I don't want to be part of this system. What does the panel have to say to the victim of social democracy?
Okay, this lady here.
You say it's all over, so how do we reconstitute either party politics or re-engage citizens in having a sense of power in a democratic sort of force?
The gentleman behind you with the glasses.
Yeah, we've heard a lot about why you need to provide something different, but then you said that what the Social Democratic Party needs to do is to use technology to capture new voters and to put their message across. Why, with technology being the newest thing that we've had in the last 20 years, can that not be the message that they're getting across? And that be a progressive movement like the Liberal Party did in the 1800s, this be a technological revolution led by social democracy?
You can tweet that right now.
Yeah, I see we're quite a few Scandinavians today, and I was quite interested in the question about Finland, because I'm from Denmark, which is also one of those wonderful welfare states, but I think, to be honest, we're telling part of the answer of why people aren't voting for it, because what we've seen is a party rising on the idea of to take social democracy for everybody who was born in Denmark and whose parents were born in Denmark, and they've been very, very successful in creating this whole idea of social democracy, but with very strong anti-immigration. And to be honest, I think that's part of social democracy's problem, that there's no them, there's no sort of who we're actually going against. We're not going against the capitalists anymore, we're not going against the immigrants, except for Denmark, obviously. So how does social democracy actually deal with the question of making people care about it if it's for everybody? There's no kind of antagonisms. Where's the passion then, and how do you keep people to it then?
Okay, great. And the gentleman. I'm really sorry to
Hi.
hear about
Rowenna said that I'd love to vote for you, but the Labour Party, of course, historians would say, wasn't found by worker struggle. It was the Labour Party. It was the Labour movement's managed bureaucracy. Thank you, Mike. But one of the questions would be when arguing politically with some of those white workers, they would be arguing, for example, that no immigration, don't bring in Polish workers, black workers. And I would love to vote for somebody like you. So Mike, who do we vote for now? What do we do in terms of anti-capitalist politics? Is there any possibility for us in the future for people who are challenging capitalism? And that's what I would like to vote for.
Okay, I know there's a lot of people that want to speak, and I'm really sorry, we are rapidly running out of time. One more? Social democratic style, we'll go for one more. Loan from the bank. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, my problem with the argument that social democracy is dead and that it died long ago is that it's quite an old argument. We've heard that it was it died in 1968. But in 1957, J.B. Priestley, in his play Topside, argued that the Labour Party died long ago, and it was already dead in 1957. His argument was that the Labour Party actually died when the Labour MPs stopped wearing cloth caps coming to the House of Commons, and that all their idealism and principles had already gone out the window under the government of Ramsay MacDonald in the 1930s. So I guess one of the problems with socialism and social democracy in general is it's quite utopian, and so it's really difficult to ever have in its full form. So people have always been arguing that it's never complete, and it's, so the argument that socialism is dead is kind of almost older than socialism itself.
Thank you. Okay, if I could ask the panel to just come back and make their summary remarks. We are really pushed for time, so 2 or 3 minutes tops. Thank you.
Okay. First of all, I will be here, so I'm happy to take your questions in person after the discussion. But my summary of the whole point I wanted to make is basically, yes, social democratic values show that they can be coupled with economic success, as shown in Northern Europe and the Nordics, and basically this consensus which is there. I mean, it's not only shared by social democratic parties in Finland, Denmark, Sweden and elsewhere. It's a consensus. No party would actually, not even the True Finns, which got 20% in the last federal elections, but which is a right-wing party which is anti-European, but actually these people also support free education and actually have more social democratic values, traditional social democratic values than the normal social democratic party in Finland, for example. So it's a consensus which is present in these countries. And this is due to the culture and historical reasons, but I mean, yeah, I don't have time to elaborate on that here. And my stance is that parties here in continental Europe, as well as the Labour Party, should aggressively argue for this vision and for this combination of economic success coupled with equal opportunities, which is created in these countries. As I said, Finland, completely state education system, and is one of the top performers at the PISA tests with Korea and Canada. Second of all, I still believe that technology and adapting to the new lifestyles of the current youth is important and will help to get new people on board and to attract new volunteers. Unfortunately, this is not actively propagated in Germany, for example, but I think this will be an important factor for future success. And one last point, in Germany I see in the new education system, or the new program for the education improvement from the Social Democrats, that they're actually trying to embrace Nordic values, and I think this will be successful. Increasing top income tax rates for the high net worth individuals and putting that money into education. I think this is popular and is supported by the majority of people in the whole Europe. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll clap at the end for everybody, please. Rowenna.
Right, just before I begin my summary, I just want to disagree with the internet argument, because parties in the left will not rejuvenate by going onto Facebook and Twitter. I agree with this gentleman here that you need something to say before you do that. Twitter in this country is a tool for influencing influences. It is governed by largely a Westminster elite. People out there don't care about it. You have to actually have something to say, and you have to have face-to-face interaction. That is more important. Yes, dealing with new media is necessary. It is nowhere near sufficient. On just my particular summary that I really want to get back to, the position of Blue Labour is that in the past, New Labour was too hands-off with the market and too hands-on with the state. So we literally allowed the capital sector to grow with having no real influence or constraint on that, or encouraging real jobs to grow where you actually make and produce real services and real goods. This is why I really have to know the name of this gentleman over here that prefers me. What's your name, sir? What's your name? John, I'm giving you a copy of my book because
well done for the prize.
Well done for the prize. Because never, he basically stood up and said the exact argument I made in the book to me as a criticism, and so you really have to get a copy of the book so that you can see that. The starting position. I'll ask you to sign it. Thank you. Tough love going on here. But the starting position of Blue Labour is anything that gives without asking something in return is humiliating, okay? And that an economic contribution to services is not enough. And one of the examples, one of the kind of core values of Blue Labour I'm interested in is the idea about reciprocity. So on that, just to explain the community land trust rather than the council house, if you give someone a stake in a community land trust, that means that they have to be responsible for governing how that operates, and they have to take responsibility for how it's run. It's not a straight transfer of resources. It comes with an obligation and a sense of power and a sense of control that's really important. If your argument, John, is we shouldn't be engaging at all with people, we shouldn't be working with people at all to change things or give them anything or have any kind of exchange, that's the end of politics. But what I'm saying is, yes, provide opportunities, but ask something back. Ask to do something transformational. It has to be two-way, and let's try and have policies that pursue that. Another example of that is the third model that Blue Labour advocates, which is basically every public service would have a third worker representation, a third user representation, and a third owner representation, so that you have different interests at the table negotiating and governing things for themselves. I leave that to you to think about how that might work. One example would be in a school, for example, you'd have a third teachers, a third parents, and a third people who state funders, for example, to see how that might work better. You know, and also it is about conditionality as well. Part of that relationship deal, part of that two-way street is to say that, you know, if you were a recent policy by James Pennell is that if you were out of work for 1 year, the state would provide you with a job, but you would be obliged to take it. I mean, that's quite an interesting idea for me. So yeah, let's continue the debate outside, because it's obviously not over yet.
I'm glad to hear it wasn't a third pupils. Mike.
I quite agree with the point that was made about the death of Labour. The death of social democracy has been proclaimed very many times in the past. I think the person with the greatest claim to authority in that matter was Lenin, who proclaimed it in 1914 with the great capitulation of the social democratic parties at the beginning of the First World War that led to the collapse of the Second International. Now, it's true that social democracy survived that moment, and in various forms it's persisted ever since. But I think that it's important to differentiate between the persistence of forms of organisations and the evacuation of their content that they historically represented. And yet you see that in the whole relationship between the trade unions and the Labour Party. The trade unions still exist. But the trade unions have a very formal relationship to the people that they claim to represent. There's no relation to the historic notion of workers banding together to fight employers to advance their interests. Trade unions are much more concerned with making claims on behalf of their employers, their members suffering from stress in the workplace, or manifesting themselves as being ill in some way as a result of their work experience. So that whole historic relationship has gone, and the person made the point, I think, quite rightly in response to Rowenna, is that the working class didn't form the Labour Party. The Labour Party was formed by the leadership of the trade union movement. There were working class people formed socialist organisations which later affiliated with the Labour Party, but that's a very important difference. You know, the Labour Party was formed as a vehicle of the Labour bureaucracy to pursue its interests in the parliamentary sphere. So it had well, I think there's history. Historically, I don't think there can be much dispute about that. But I think that as Rowenna personifies, there's a great deal of scope. Very capable people are pursuing the Labour label in new forms, and it may well have a certain impact. Social democracy, it is not. It is something entirely new, fine, you know, but it doesn't fulfil that traditional historic role. Some people say, well, what else should we do? There's a lot of things what else we should do, but and indeed we're doing them here. You know, the preconditions for challenging the political system at the moment in the political sphere don't exist, and we have to clarify the ideological basis of organising any political movement in the current situation. And it seems to me that's what we're engaged in here.
Can we thank our speakers?